In the winter of 1893, a physician named Harold Fenwick stood before the Royal Medical Society in London and declared that fear was not an emotion, but a disease, and like any disease, it could be cured. The room fell silent. Some colleagues leaned forward, intrigued. Others exchanged glances of concern. Fenwick was not known for theatrics or wild speculation. He was a respected neurologist who had trained under Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, a man whose reputation had been built on careful observation and methodical documentation. Yet here he stood, proposing something that bordered on the impossible, something that would challenge the very foundations of human psychology before psychology even had proper foundations. What happened next would not be recorded in textbooks. The experiments that followed would be hidden in private journals, whispered about in medical circles, and eventually buried beneath layers of institutional silence. But the question remains, suspended in the cold air of history. What exactly did Dr. Harold Fenwick discover in his pursuit to cure fear itself? And why did the medical establishment work so diligently to erase his name from the record? Harold Fenwick was born in 1851 in the industrial heart of Manchester, the fourth son of a textile mill owner who had accumulated modest wealth through shrewd investments during Britain's manufacturing boom. His childhood was unremarkable except for one incident that his younger sister Elizabeth would later describe in her correspondence. At age 7, Harold witnessed a factory accident that killed 3 workers when a steam boiler exploded. While other children were rushed away from the scene, Harold remained transfixed, watching the chaos unfold with what Elizabeth called an unsettling calmness. He did not cry or scream, he simply observed. When questioned later by his mother, Harold explained that he was trying to understand why some people ran toward the danger while others froze completely. Even as a child, it seemed, he was fascinated by the mechanics of human response to terror. This fascination would follow him through his education at Edinburgh Medical School, where he graduated with honors in 1874, and into his early career as a general practitioner in the slums of East London, where fear wore many faces: fear of disease, fear of poverty, fear of the workhouse, fear of death itself. The London of the 1870s and 1880s was a city of stark contrasts, where opulence and destitution existed within blocks of each other, where scientific progress marched forward even as ancient superstitions clung to the shadows of gaslit streets. The medical profession was undergoing a transformation. Germ theory was beginning to replace miasma theory. Anesthesia had revolutionized surgery, and the asylum system was expanding rapidly as mental illness became increasingly medicalized rather than moralized. Yet despite these advances, the human mind remained largely mysterious. Physicians could treat the body with growing confidence, but the interior landscape of thought and emotion remained unmapped territory. It was into this world that Fenwick began to develop his theories about fear, theories that would initially seem rational, but would gradually lead him into increasingly controversial territory. He started by observing his patients in Whitechapel, noting how some individuals exposed to the same traumatic events, the same threats of violence or disease, would respond entirely differently. One person might develop what would later be called post-traumatic symptoms, while another would seem emotionally untouched. Why? The prevailing explanation of the time attributed such differences to moral character or hereditary weakness, but Fenwick suspected something deeper was at work. In 1881, Fenwick left his practice in London to study under Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, a massive institution that housed thousands of patients, primarily women diagnosed with hysteria, epilepsy, and various forms of madness. Charcot was then at the height of his fame, conducting his famous demonstrations where he would induce and remove hysterical symptoms through hypnosis, apparently proving that many neurological conditions had psychological rather than physiological origins. Fenwick spent 2 years in Paris, attending Charcot's lectures and observing his clinical demonstrations. But while other students were captivated by the dramatic nature of hysteria, Fenwick became interested in what he perceived as the underlying mechanism, the capacity of the mind to create physical symptoms in response to psychological stimuli. He began to theorize that if the mind could generate paralysis, blindness, or seizures without organic cause, perhaps it could also generate the physical manifestations of fear without genuine threat. And if that generation could be understood, perhaps it could be prevented. Perhaps fear could be disabled at its source. The idea was audacious, perhaps even arrogant, but Fenwick was convinced he was onto something fundamental about human neurology. When Fenwick returned to London in 1883, he established a private practice in Harley Street, the prestigious medical district where wealthy patients sought treatment for ailments both real and imagined. His reputation as a serious neurologist attracted a steady stream of clients, many suffering from what Victorians called nervous disorders, anxiety, melancholia, neurasthenia, and various phobias that had no clear physical basis. Fenwick approached each case as a puzzle to be solved. He took meticulous notes, documenting not just symptoms, but the circumstances surrounding their onset, the patient's personal history, and any patterns he could discern. One case particularly captured his attention. A young woman named Margaret Ashford, 23 years old, had developed an overwhelming fear of open spaces after witnessing a carriage accident in Hyde Park. The fear was so intense that she had not left her home in 6 months. Her family had consulted multiple physicians, tried various tonics and rest cures, but nothing helped. When Fenwick first met her, Margaret could barely speak about the incident without experiencing palpitations, trembling, and what she described as a sensation of impending death. Fenwick spent weeks interviewing her, carefully reconstructing not just the accident itself, but her emotional state before, during, and after. He began to develop a hypothesis that fear, in cases like Margaret's, was not a natural response to danger, but a learned response that had become pathologically entrenched in the nervous system. To understand Fenwick's thinking, one must understand the state of neurological knowledge in the late 19th century. The brain was increasingly understood as an electrical organ, a network of nerves that transmitted signals through what scientists called neural pathways. Researchers had begun mapping different brain regions, discovering that specific areas controlled specific functions. If damage to one region could eliminate the ability to speak, Fenwick reasoned, then perhaps damage or manipulation of another region could eliminate the capacity for fear. But he was not considering physical damage. Instead, drawing on his work with Charcot, he believed that the pathways responsible for fear responses could be psychologically reconfigured, essentially teaching the brain to stop generating fear signals in response to previously frightening stimuli. This was not dissimilar to modern cognitive behavioral therapy, except that Fenwick's ambitions went further. He did not want to help patients manage their fear. He wanted to eliminate it entirely, to find what he called the fear center and disable it permanently. Between 1884 and 1889, Fenwick conducted what he termed graduated exposure experiments with dozens of patients suffering from various phobias. The treatment involved carefully controlled exposure to the feared object or situation, combined with what Fenwick described as neuro-retraining through repetitive suggestion and occasionally mild electrical stimulation to specific cranial nerves. His patient records from this period, which would surface decades later in an archive at Cambridge University, reveal both successes and failures. Some patients reported complete relief from their phobias. Others showed no improvement. A few showed new and unexpected symptoms. One man who had been treated for a fear of heights reported afterward that he no longer felt fear in dangerous situations at all, a condition Fenwick noted with both fascination and concern. The man later died in a factory accident, reportedly walking across a narrow beam 4 stories above the ground with complete confidence before losing his balance. Was the treatment responsible? Fenwick did not say publicly, but in his private journal he wrote a single sentence: "Have I removed protection or merely burden?" It was around this time that Fenwick began to shift his focus from treating phobias to studying fear itself as a neurological phenomenon. He started visiting hospitals and asylums, observing patients in acute states of terror, documenting their physiological responses. Pupils dilated, breathing shallow and rapid, heart rate elevated, skin cold and damp, muscles tensed for flight or fight. These were not mysteries, they were well-documented symptoms. But Fenwick was looking for something else. He was looking for the moment of transition, the precise instant when a neutral stimulus became frightening, when the brain decided to activate the fear response. He believed that if he could identify that moment, that neural decision point, he could potentially interrupt it. His research notes from this period reveal an increasingly single-minded obsession. He was no longer simply treating patients. He was conducting experiments in human consciousness itself. In 1890, Fenwick proposed a controversial study to the Royal Medical Society. He wanted to create what he called a controlled fear environment, where volunteers would be exposed to genuinely frightening stimuli, while Fenwick and his colleagues monitored their physiological and psychological responses. The goal was to map the fear response in unprecedented detail, and then attempt to modify it through various interventions. The proposal was met with skepticism and ethical concerns. Several members of the society argued that deliberately frightening people for research purposes crossed moral boundaries that medicine should not cross. Others questioned whether anything meaningful could be learned from such experiments. But Fenwick had influential supporters, including Sir William Gull, the physician who had attended Queen Victoria, and who was intrigued by Fenwick's theories about the neurological basis of emotion. With Gull's backing, a modified version of Fenwick's proposal was approved for a limited trial involving volunteer subjects who would be compensated for their participation. The experiments began in the spring of 1891 at a private facility in Hampstead, a converted manor house that Fenwick leased for the purpose. He recruited 12 volunteers, all men between the ages of 20 and 40 from various social backgrounds. They were informed that they would be exposed to frightening situations as part of a neurological study, and that they could withdraw at any time. What constituted frightening situations in Fenwick's design? The records are fragmentary, but they suggest a progression of scenarios: unexpected loud noises, simulated falls, encounters with aggressive dogs, darkness and confined spaces, and eventually more elaborate scenarios involving what Fenwick called genuine mortal ambiguity, situations where the subject could not be certain whether they were in actual danger or merely believed themselves to be. One subject reported being placed in a room that began to fill with water, though he was assured afterward that he was never in true peril. Another described being led blindfolded to the edge of what felt like a precipice, though it was actually only a few feet above ground. The purpose was not to harm, but to activate the fear response at maximum intensity so that it could be studied and, hopefully, interrupted. The results of these initial experiments were both encouraging and troubling. Fenwick documented that repeated exposure to the same frightening stimulus did indeed reduce the fear response in most subjects, a finding that anticipated later research on habituation and extinction of conditioned responses. But some subjects showed unexpected reactions. 2 men developed what Fenwick termed emotional flattening, reporting that they no longer felt fear even in situations where fear would be appropriate and protective. One of these men, identified in the records only as Subject G, told Fenwick that he felt as if a vital part of himself had been removed, that the world seemed less real, that he could observe danger intellectually but could no longer feel its urgency. Fenwick was disturbed by this outcome. He had wanted to cure pathological fear, not eliminate the emotion entirely. Yet, here was evidence that the repeated activation and suppression of fear responses could fundamentally alter emotional processing. The question that haunted him, the question he wrote repeatedly in his journal, was whether this represented a cure or a different kind of damage. By 1892, Fenwick had refined his experimental protocol based on what he had learned. He began to focus specifically on what he called the fear conditioning process, attempting to trace how the brain learns to associate specific stimuli with danger and how those associations might be weakened or erased. He recruited a new group of subjects, this time including both men and women, and designed a series of controlled experiments that would involve pairing neutral stimuli with genuinely unpleasant experiences, then attempting to break those associations through various interventions, including hypnosis, chemical sedation, and what he termed neural interruption techniques that involved applying electrical current to specific points on the skull. Modern readers will recognize the ethical problems immediately, but in the Victorian era, medical research operated under far less stringent oversight. Patients and experimental subjects were expected to trust the expertise and moral judgment of physicians. The concept of informed consent as we understand it today did not exist. Subjects were told they were participating in important medical research and that some discomfort might be involved, but they were not always fully informed about the nature or extent of the experiments. It was during this second phase of research that Fenwick claimed his most significant breakthrough. In a presentation to a small group of colleagues in November 1892, he reported that he had successfully eliminated a conditioned fear response in 3 subjects through what he called fear center inhibition. The technique involved hypnosis combined with electrical stimulation, and according to Fenwick, the results were dramatic and permanent. The subjects, who had been conditioned to fear a particular sound by pairing it with electric shock, showed no fear response when the sound was presented after treatment. Their heart rate remained normal, they showed no startle reflex, they reported feeling complete indifference to a stimulus that had previously caused significant distress. Fenwick believed he had found the key to curing not just phobias, but trauma, anxiety disorders, and any condition rooted in pathological fear. But several physicians in the audience asked the obvious question: what were the long-term effects? What happened when these subjects encountered genuine danger? Had Fenwick cured their fear or simply broken their ability to sense threat? Fenwick did not have good answers to these questions, and this uncertainty seemed to fuel rather than temper his ambition. He began working longer hours, seeing fewer regular patients, devoting almost all his time to his research subjects. His colleagues noticed changes in his demeanor. He became more withdrawn, more defensive when questioned about his methods, more insistent that his work represented a fundamental advance in medical science. His wife, Clara, whom he had married in 1877, expressed concerns in letters to her sister that Harold had become obsessed, that he spent entire nights in his laboratory, that he spoke of his work with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction. She worried that he was losing perspective, that his desire to prove his theories was overwhelming his judgment. These concerns would prove tragically prescient. In January 1893, one of Fenwick's research subjects, a 32-year-old clerk named Thomas Pemberton, died under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that Pemberton had been participating in one of Fenwick's fear experiments earlier that day. According to a statement given by another subject present at the time, Pemberton had been placed in a scenario designed to induce extreme fear, though the exact nature of the scenario was never publicly disclosed. During the experiment, Pemberton apparently collapsed. Fenwick attempted to revive him, but Pemberton died before other medical assistants could arrive. The incident was investigated by both the police and the Royal Medical Society. Fenwick maintained that Pemberton had an undiagnosed heart condition and that the stress of the experiment had triggered a cardiac event that would have occurred eventually regardless of the circumstances. The coroner's inquest ultimately supported this conclusion, and no charges were filed. But rumors circulated in medical circles that Pemberton's death was not simply an unfortunate coincidence, that something in Fenwick's experimental protocol had directly caused the fatal cardiac event. The death of Thomas Pemberton should have ended Fenwick's research, but instead it seemed to intensify his determination. In the months following the inquest, he withdrew even further from public medical practice and focused entirely on his experiments. He relocated his research to a property in rural Sussex, away from London scrutiny, and recruited new subjects from workhouses and charitable institutions, individuals who were perhaps less able to refuse participation or fully understand what they were consenting to. This is the period about which we know the least, the months between March and December 1893, when Fenwick was working in relative isolation. His laboratory notes from this time are chaotic and difficult to decipher, filled with increasingly technical terminology and theoretical speculation. But certain themes emerge. He had become convinced that fear was not just a neurological response, but what he called a fundamental organizing principle of human consciousness, that the capacity for fear shaped perception, memory, and even identity itself. To remove fear entirely, he theorized, would not simply create a fearless person, but would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. This is when Fenwick appears to have made a decision that would define his legacy. If fear was truly fundamental to human consciousness, then the only way to prove his theories would be to test them on someone who could fully understand and articulate the experience of having fear removed. He would have to experiment on himself. The evidence for this decision comes from a series of journal entries written between September and November 1893. In them, Fenwick describes preparing for what he calls the ultimate validation of his research. He writes about fear as a kind of evolutionary vestige, something that had been necessary for human survival in a primitive world, but had become maladaptive in modern civilization. He argues that humanity's next stage of development would involve transcending fear, learning to evaluate danger rationally without the distorting influence of emotion. And he suggests that he has refined his techniques to the point where he can safely apply them to himself, removing his own capacity for fear and documenting the results from the inside. What exactly Fenwick did to himself remains unclear. His journal entries become increasingly fragmented and difficult to interpret. He describes sessions where he used a combination of self-hypnosis, electrical stimulation, and possibly certain chemical compounds, though he does not specify which ones. He writes about experiencing profound alterations in perception, about seeing the world with absolute clarity stripped of emotional coloring, about understanding fear as a kind of background noise that had always been present but was now silent. He reports feeling liberated, enlightened, capable of pure rationality. But there are also disturbing passages. He writes about feeling disconnected from his own body, about watching himself perform actions as if from outside, about struggling to understand why certain things that should matter to him no longer seem to have any significance. In one particularly chilling entry dated November 12, 1893, he writes, "I have achieved what I set out to achieve. I no longer experience fear, but in its absence, I find that many other things have also disappeared. Concern, urgency, the sense that anything truly matters." Is this victory, or have I simply made myself incapable of caring about the difference? On December 3, 1893, Harold Fenwick delivered his famous presentation to the Royal Medical Society, the one mentioned at the beginning of this account. He stood before his colleagues and declared that fear was a disease and that he had found the cure. But those who were present later reported that something about Fenwick seemed profoundly wrong. He spoke in a monotone, showing no emotion even when describing his most dramatic findings. When colleagues challenged his claims or raised ethical concerns, he responded with a cold rationality that many found unsettling. He seemed unable to understand why others were troubled by his methods. One physician who questioned the safety of his self-experimentation reported that Fenwick looked at him with complete indifference and said, "Safety is a concern born of fear. I no longer have such concerns." The presentation ended in confusion and controversy. Some members called for Fenwick's medical license to be revoked. Others suggested he needed psychiatric evaluation. The meeting was adjourned without any formal resolution, and Fenwick left the hall surrounded by colleagues who were no longer sure whether they were dealing with a brilliant innovator or a man who had damaged himself irrevocably in pursuit of his theories. What happened next depends on which sources you consult, and this is where the historical record becomes frustratingly incomplete. Some accounts claim that Fenwick returned to his laboratory in Sussex and continued his work in total isolation. Others suggest that his wife Clara, increasingly alarmed by his deteriorating mental state, arranged for him to be evaluated by alienists, the Victorian-era term for psychiatrists. There are records indicating that in January 1894, Fenwick was briefly admitted to Bethlem Royal Hospital, the infamous Bedlam, though the exact circumstances of this admission and how long he remained there are disputed. What is certain is that Fenwick ceased all public medical practice and research after December 1893. His laboratory in Sussex was closed, his equipment sold or destroyed, his research notes scattered. By 1895, Harold Fenwick had essentially disappeared from the medical community entirely. The fate of Fenwick's research subjects is equally murky. Several appear in medical records of the period, but always under pseudonyms or with identifying details obscured. There are references to individuals treated for unusual emotional disturbances, cases where patients reported feeling disconnected from normal human responses, unable to experience fear even when facing genuine danger. One case from 1897 describes a man who had to be institutionalized because he repeatedly engaged in life-threatening behavior, apparently unable to recognize risk. The physician treating him noted that the patient claimed to have participated in neurological experiments several years earlier, and that something had been done to his brain that removed his capacity for self-preservation. Is this one of Fenwick's subjects? The records do not say explicitly, but the timeline and description are suggestive. For nearly 3 decades after his presentation to the Royal Medical Society, Harold Fenwick existed in a kind of historical limbo, neither celebrated nor condemned, simply forgotten. Medical textbooks did not mention his work. His papers were not preserved in major archives. It was as if the medical establishment had collectively decided that Fenwick and his research should be quietly erased from the record. But in 1921, a curious document surfaced. A researcher named Dr. Margaret Cleves, working on a history of experimental psychology, discovered a collection of letters in the archives of the Royal Medical Society. These letters, written between 1894 and 1896, were from physicians across Britain reporting unusual cases that seemed connected to Fenwick's research. They described patients who had participated in experiments involving fear conditioning and removal, patients who now displayed what the physicians called emotional absence or affective void. Several letters expressed concern that Fenwick's techniques, whatever they had been, had caused permanent psychological damage. But there was something else in these letters, something that Cleves found deeply troubling. Multiple physicians reported that they had been instructed by senior members of the Royal Medical Society not to publish case studies or discuss these patients publicly, to avoid what was termed unnecessary scandal that might damage the reputation of British medicine. This discovery raised an obvious question. Had there been a deliberate effort to suppress information about Fenwick's research and its consequences? Dr. Cleves certainly thought so. She published a brief article in the Journal of Psychological Medicine in 1922, arguing that Fenwick's case represented an important historical example of medical ethics violation and institutional cover-up. She called for a full investigation into what had happened to Fenwick's research subjects and whether any of them were still alive and in need of medical care. Her article generated some academic interest, but no official investigation. The Royal Medical Society issued a statement saying that Fenwick's work had been deemed scientifically invalid decades earlier and that no cover-up had occurred, simply a collective recognition that his methods were unsound and his claims unsubstantiated. But Cleves was not satisfied. She spent the next several years trying to locate Harold Fenwick himself, to interview him and reconstruct what had actually happened during those crucial months in 1893. What she eventually discovered would complicate the story even further. In 1924, after extensive research, Margaret Cleves traced Harold Fenwick to a small cottage in the village of Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast. He was 73 years old, living alone, supported by a modest income from investments his father had made decades earlier. Cleves wrote to him requesting an interview, and somewhat surprisingly, Fenwick agreed. She traveled to Lyme Regis in September 1924 and spent 3 days interviewing him. Her notes from these interviews were not published during her lifetime, but were later deposited in the Wellcome Library in London, where they remain today. They make for extraordinary and disturbing reading. Fenwick, now an old man, spoke freely about his research, showing neither pride nor shame, simply a detached clinical interest in what he had attempted. He confirmed that he had indeed experimented on himself, that he had used electrical stimulation and hypnotic techniques in an attempt to disable what he called the fear circuits in his own brain. When Cleves asked whether he had succeeded, Fenwick's answer was both definitive and ambiguous. "I no longer experience fear," he told her, "but I can no longer be certain whether I removed it or simply removed my ability to recognize its absence." Cleves pressed him on the fate of his research subjects. How many had there been in total? What had happened to them after his research ended? Fenwick claimed he had lost track of most of them, that in the chaos following Thomas Pemberton's death and his own mental crisis, his records had been scattered or destroyed. But he acknowledged that several subjects had reported lasting effects, that some had sought him out years later, complaining of emotional numbness or inability to feel normal human responses. He said he had tried to help them, but had no techniques for reversing what he had done, no way to restore fear once it had been successfully removed. When Cleves asked if he felt any guilt or responsibility for the harm he might have caused, Fenwick paused for a long time before responding. Finally, he said, "Guilt is an emotion predicated on fear, fear of moral judgment and social condemnation. I can intellectually understand that I may have caused harm, but I cannot feel the emotional weight of that understanding. Do you see the paradox? In curing myself of fear, I may have also cured myself of the capacity for remorse." The interviews reveal other details about Fenwick's life after 1893. His wife Clara had left him in 1895, unable to continue living with a man who seemed emotionally absent despite being physically present. They never divorced, but they lived separately until Clara's death in 1919. Fenwick had no children. He spent most of his time reading, walking along the coast, and writing what he called philosophical reflections on consciousness and emotion, though he never attempted to publish these writings and apparently destroyed most of them shortly before his death. Cleves asked what he thought his legacy would be, whether he believed his research had contributed anything valuable to medical science. Fenwick told her that he had discovered something important, but that the medical establishment was not ready to accept it. That human emotions, including fear, were not sacred or essential aspects of identity, but were simply neurological processes that could be modified or eliminated. He predicted that within a century, medicine would develop techniques far more sophisticated than his crude electrical and hypnotic methods, techniques that could selectively remove specific emotions or memories or aspects of personality. And he suggested that when that future arrived, society would have to confront the same questions he had confronted. Just because we can remove fear, should we? What are the costs of such removal? Do we lose something essential in the process, or do we simply free ourselves from an evolutionary burden that no longer serves us? Harold Fenwick died in June 1926 at the age of 75. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. He had no surviving family, and his funeral was attended by only a handful of people from the village who knew him as an eccentric old man who took long walks regardless of weather. Margaret Cleves was not informed of his death until several weeks later. When she traveled to Lyme Regis to investigate, she found that Fenwick's cottage had already been cleared out by a distant cousin who had inherited the property. Most of Fenwick's possessions, including any papers or notebooks he might have kept, had been burned or thrown away. The cousin told Cleves that there had been very little of value, just clothes and books and what looked like strange diagrams and unintelligible writing that seemed to be the ravings of a disturbed mind. Whatever final insights Fenwick might have recorded were lost. And yet, the story does not quite end there. In the decades following Fenwick's death, occasional references to his work appeared in obscure medical journals and psychological texts. Most dismissed him as a cautionary tale, an example of how brilliant physicians could be led astray by obsession and insufficient ethical oversight. But a few researchers found something valuable in his ideas. During the 1950s and 1960s, as behavioral psychology developed techniques for treating phobias through systematic desensitization and exposure therapy, some clinicians noted that they were essentially implementing refined versions of Fenwick's graduated experiments minus the electrical stimulation and hypnosis. The fundamental insight that repeated, controlled exposure to feared stimuli could reduce or eliminate fear responses had been validated by subsequent research, even if Fenwick's specific methods remained ethically problematic. Similarly, modern neuroscience has confirmed Fenwick's basic hypothesis that fear involves specific brain circuits, particularly the amygdala, that can indeed be modified through experience or intervention. In a sense, Fenwick was right about the neurological basis of fear, even if his techniques for manipulating it were crude and dangerous. But the deeper questions Fenwick raised remain unresolved. Modern medicine can treat pathological fear and anxiety with increasing effectiveness through medication and therapy, but we still struggle with the philosophical and ethical implications. Recent research on reconsolidation blockade, a technique where memories are recalled and then chemically disrupted to reduce their emotional impact, has revived debates about whether we should eliminate traumatic memories and the fears associated with them. Proponents argue that this could revolutionize treatment for PTSD and severe anxiety disorders. Critics worry about the implications of selectively editing consciousness, about whether trauma and fear, however painful, serve important psychological functions. These are essentially the same debates that divided Fenwick's colleagues in 1893, dressed in modern terminology. We have better tools now, more sophisticated understanding, but the fundamental question remains: if we can remove fear, should we? And if we do, what else might we inadvertently remove in the process? There is one final piece to this story, a detail that emerged only recently and that casts everything in a slightly different light. In 2018, a researcher at Cambridge University named Dr. Sarah Whitmore was cataloging Victorian-era medical archives when she discovered a sealed envelope among papers donated by the family of Sir William Gull, the physician who had supported Fenwick's initial research proposal. The envelope was marked "to be opened only after my death" and dated 1895. Inside was a letter from Harold Fenwick to Gull, written shortly after Fenwick's admission to Bethlehem Hospital. In it, Fenwick describes the aftermath of his self-experimentation in greater detail than he had revealed to anyone else. He writes about experiencing profound dissociation, about feeling as if he were observing his own life from outside, about struggling to understand why anything mattered. But then he writes something unexpected. He says that after several months, some emotional capacity began to return. Not fear specifically, but a kind of generalized sense of connection and concern. He describes it as learning to feel again, slowly and incompletely, as if the brain were attempting to rebuild pathways that had been damaged. He speculates that his techniques had not permanently destroyed the fear circuits, but had temporarily disrupted them, and that the brain, being plastic and adaptive, had begun to develop compensatory mechanisms. If Fenwick's account in this letter is accurate, it suggests that his experiment did not have the permanent effects he had initially claimed. Perhaps the emotional absence he described to Margaret Cleves in 1924 was not because fear had been permanently removed, but because he had never fully recovered from the damage he had inflicted on himself. Or perhaps he was simply unable to distinguish between the two states. The letter raises as many questions as it answers. Why did Fenwick write to Go but then apparently never follow up? Why did Go keep the letter sealed rather than sharing its contents with other physicians who might have learned from Fenwick's experience? Was there more that Fenwick discovered but chose not to reveal? The letter ends with a sentence that reads almost like a warning. I have learned that the brain's architecture is more complex and more resilient than we understand. That our attempts to selectively modify consciousness will always have consequences we cannot predict. And that the question is not whether we should try to cure fear, but whether we should be afraid of succeeding. Today, Harold Fenwick exists as a footnote in the history of neurology and psychology, remembered, if at all, as an overzealous experimenter who caused harm in pursuit of an impossible goal. But perhaps that assessment is too simple. Fenwick was asking questions that remain urgent and unresolved. Questions about the nature of emotion, the ethics of psychological intervention, and the boundaries of medical research. He pursued those questions with insufficient caution and inadequate ethical guardrails, causing genuine harm to himself and others. Yet the questions themselves were and are legitimate. As we develop ever more powerful tools for modifying consciousness, from pharmacologies to brain stimulation to genetic engineering, we will increasingly face the choices that confronted Fenwick. Which aspects of human experience should we try to alter? Which should we leave intact? And how can we distinguish between cure and damage when the two might be nearly indistinguishable? Fenwick believed he was curing fear. His critics believed he was destroying something essential. Perhaps both were right. If you enjoy uncovering stories lost in darkness, don't forget to subscribe to Wither Truths and leave a like. These forgotten chapters of medical history matter because they illuminate not just the past, but the choices we face today. The boundaries Fenwick crossed are still being negotiated. The questions he raised are still being debated. And the fears he tried to cure remain deeply woven into the fabric of human consciousness. Was Fenwick a visionary who glimpsed the future of neurological medicine? Or was he a cautionary tale about the dangers of tampering with fundamental aspects of human psychology? Share in the comments, what do you think? Was the removal of fear a cure or a kind of death? Would you, if you could, choose to live without fear, knowing what Fenwick discovered about what that choice might cost? The archives hold no simple answers, only fragments and hints, testimonies and silences. Harold Fenwick tried to cure fear itself and may have succeeded, at least partially, at least temporarily, at least in ways he could not control or fully understand. What he left behind is not a solution, but a mystery wrapped in a question that each generation must answer for itself. If we could be freed from fear, would we still be human? Or would we be something else entirely? Something neither better nor worse, but simply and irretrievably different? The doctor who tried to cure fear discovered that the cure might be indistinguishable from the disease. That in seeking to liberate human consciousness from its evolutionary shackles, he had perhaps only traded one form of imprisonment for another. And in the cold light of history, we are left wondering whether he ever truly understood what he had found, or whether, in removing his own capacity for fear, he had also removed his ability to comprehend the full significance of what he had done. The question lingers in the archives, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to follow the path Fenwick traced into the darkest corners of human neurology, where the boundary between healing and harm grows thin, and where the cost of knowledge might be the very thing we seek to preserve.